It's so wonderful to see everyone here. Thank you for joining us. I'm really excited to have this conversation about looking at structural violence as a framework for understanding climate change. But before we really delve into this material, I really want to take a moment to acknowledge the traditional lands. So I am based at Royal Roads University, as is Selena, and Royal Roads University is within Victoria, and the campus is located on the traditional lands of the Kusapsan and the Algonquin ancestors and families. And it is really with gratitude that we work, live, and play on these lands. And when we're looking at something as important as climate change and the impacts on the environment, it's so important that we turn to our lands to see who has been shepherding them before us. And with that, I really invite you to also take a moment to acknowledge the lands that you are on. And I can see from the participant lists that we have people from all around the world, and would really love if people want to put in the chat function the traditional lands if you know where you are on, but otherwise where you are coming from in the world with us today. And while we see that, it would be wonderful to also take a moment to recognize the sponsors for this event. This is Royal Roads University, in particular, the Graduate Certificate in Transforming Child Protection to Wellbeing, which is coming up for its inaugural version this fall, but also we have the Phoenix Consultation, and I'll give a little bit more of a briefing of that, but also the International Institute of Child Rights and Development, and SERI, the Children's Environmental Rights Initiative. And with that, I'm actually going to pass this over after I take a quick look here at the chat function. We have others here from Victoria and the Kusapsan and Algonquin spaces. We have someone from Cambodia and Kenya, the Miwok land, and Rotterdam, so all over the world. So again, just a shout out to everyone, because those time zones are difficult. Someone from Togo, fantastic. This event is part of the North American Consultation to a Child's Right to a Healthy Environment. And with that, we wanted to just give a couple of minutes to review the Phoenix Consultation and their work on this consultation. And I'm going to pass this over to Rebecca Nealons, who's going to give us a little bit of an overview of the consultation. Please, Rebecca.
Thanks, Kathleen. I wonder if I could just move to sharing my screen before I, great. Thank you. Okay. Thanks so much. Thanks to Kathleen for the introduction. It's such a pleasure to be here with you all today on a topic that is so near and dear to my heart. I am also joining you today from the lands, the unceded lands of the Lekwungen and the Kusapsan families here on the northwest coast of Turtle Island, also known as North America, Vancouver Island, and Victoria, where Royal Roads is based. And I am so grateful every day for this beautiful place and the relationships that these peoples have had with the lands for millennia, such that we get to enjoy it in this way today. My name is Rebecca Nealons, as Kathleen Mannion mentioned. I am associate faculty at Royal Roads. I'm also an associate with the International Institute for Child Rights and Development. And I'm a social change theorist, and my work focuses in around relational leadership, eco-social empathy, and particularly learning from the youth climate justice movement, as well as Indigenous lifeways. We wanted to present to you a little bit about the Phoenix Consultation, which is coming up, and just give you a bit of the context of that consultation. So to start with, just to say that this whole process is really about putting young people at the center of how we move forward in transforming the world at this critical juncture in time, at this moment of eco-social crises and intersectional crises. So I don't think I need to probably explain much to this audience about the global context of climate emergency and biodiversity crisis. I know here on Lekwungen lands, we're having a tremendous heat wave at the moment, which I heard is the highest temperatures that we've had in, I believe, 1,200 years. So I don't think there's much more to say about the context for why this consultation is happening, except for to say that it's really being driven by a need for new and also drawing back on old strategies and solutions, and things that we know about how to work with the earth. So these series of consultations are being organized under the auspices of the UN Special Rapporteur on Human Rights and the Environment, and particularly with David Boyd's focus on children's rights. And there's a series of regional consultations that are being held across the world. As you can see, there was a little bit of a delay and an interruption due to the COVID context. However, we are right in the middle, our region, as you can see in terms of the time frame of regional consultations, and the focus is on the right of children and youth to a healthy environment. So this consultation is going to be taking place in a few weeks' time, and it is being collaboratively organized by the David Suzuki Foundation, the International Institute for Child Rights and Development, and the Children's Environmental Rights Initiative. These regional consultations have been organized by CIRI in each of the regions, working with local partners who have extensive networks in that region. So that's one of the reasons for that particular grouping of organizers. And the whole process is being guided by a group of young people and elders being identified as the Intergenerational Advisory Committee, who has been formed, which has youth and elder representatives from Mexico, Canada, and the US. We are also gathering input from young people across the region as part of a regional academic committee that's been working, that at the moment, I believe there's been 12 academics from 12 different universities across the region working on this to do early engagements with young people, knowing that not all of them will be able to be in the room on the day of the consultation. The desire was to hear from as many young people as possible, so their real lived experiences in the moment could inform the consultation and the discussions that the delegates have. Another very exciting feature of this consultation has been that we are partnering with some of the latest technologies that are out there. So we have approached Cisco Systems, and they have developed a new platform for us that's a combination of many different platforms, such as Slack, social media, but all in one, as well as enabling us to host events. And so that is very exciting, because the idea is that this is not just going to be an event, but hopefully a legacy event that we will set up by having ongoing platforms whereby intergenerational collaboration and networks can be organizing. One of the biggest things that we have found is that young people have struggled to sometimes connect across networks and across regions. So one of the outcomes we very much hope will come from this will be focused on that. So as mentioned, in a few weeks' time, 200 youth and adult delegates from Mexico, US, and Canada will be coming to meet virtually to discuss all of the challenges, opportunities, successes, priorities, and actions moving forward. The majority of the participants will be young people, and the event has been designed to really facilitate participatory engagement. A year into COVID, there's more knowledge about how to do this in good ways, so we hope to do that. And there's much intergenerational collaborative space as well. Some of the different elders committees across the region have been involved in some of the early engagement of youth as well, and will be also presenting and participating. And as well as mentioned, this networking platform will be an important aspect. We will have some sessions which will be publicly live streamed, and some which will be recorded and available after the event. So these are just a few of the outcomes. Of course, we know when we bring a group of amazing delegates together, there will be outcomes we can't have foreseen, but we do expect that the Global Charter on Children's Rights and the Environment will move forward a report to the UN Special Rapporteur that is deeply informed by not just the young people in the room at this virtual event, but by all of those engaging in that online platform, as well as all of the engagements we've been conducting for the last year. We expect to produce reports for each of the governments specific to the needs and successes and priorities of those countries and the delegates from those countries. And a number of social and multimedia reports are expected, as identified by young people in the event. And finally, that platform, as mentioned, we expect to continue on, and that will be a significant outcome we hope to contribute to ongoing networking. So if you want more information, please feel free to get in touch. I'd be happy to offer more information, as I know Kathleen Mann, you can also do, and happy to also take questions later.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Rebecca. It's really nice to have that overview of the process overall. I'm going to launch into now really discussing structural violence as it pertains to climate change and youth voice. And really here we're interested in the nexus of those 3 points. So just to give a little bit of an overview of what we're talking about here, Paul Farmer and colleagues suggest that structural violence are those political and economic systems and forces that work to perpetuate violence and inequalities, particularly public policies and institutional practices, cultural representations, and other norms. And Bandy Lee was one of the first scholars to really frame environmental issues as a kind of structural violence. And we wanted to take that a little bit further. And we've been having these fabulous discussions offline leading up to this event. So I'm really excited to be able to have this space to really delve into some of these discussions. And before I hand this over to Dr. Victor Karunina, just want to suggest that this is part of a series of webinars. We've had our first webinar, which was hosted by our Children's Trust, why getting climate science in court is crucial. So that's an important one to look at. In terms of looking at structural violence, we also foresee seeing 2 more in this series. Here, we're really just starting to look at the conceptual frameworks for structural violence and climate change, with the idea of moving into, hopefully in fall, another webinar looking at accountabilities and responsibilities of duty bearers, with the idea of in winter looking at some of the concrete approaches and strategies. And one last webinar I do want to flag is we want to take the lessons from the North American Consultation on a Child's Right to a Healthy Environment and specifically look at how do we do intergenerational collaboration to impact a kind of systems change like climate change. But with that, I am so excited to hand it over to Dr. Victor Karunina, who is the former Deputy Representative and Senior Social Policy Specialist with UNICEF Malaysia, but he is currently a visiting lecturer, foreign expert with the Social Policy and Development and Faculty of Administration at Thammasat University and the Institute of Human Rights and Peace Studies at Merhadal University. He is joining us from a very unsocial hour from Bangkok, and he's going to give us a little bit of an exploration of pathways to new approaches to give us a broad picture of how we might look at structural violence and climate change. So please, Victor.
I'm so pleased to be part of this discussion today on climate change and structural violence as children. Firstly, a welcome to all friends, colleagues from various traditional lands, but also cultures and histories. And I hope we can have a productive discussion today about what this implies for our children today and in the years to come. My approach to the topic is firstly to underline the fact that structural violence is a systems issue, which involves institutions like public policy, cultural representations, legal, as well as social norms and practices that exist in our societies at different levels. And how these institutions and processes work in coordination to perpetuate a certain system, whether it's inequality, whether it's poverty or violence, and similarly with climate change. So therefore, structural violence is a combination of social, political, and economic arrangements that are institutionalized in society over a period of time. They evolve as a critical feature of these societies in which they exist. And as such, they then help us determine the root causes of problems like poverty, as well as of violence in societies. So therefore, what we're talking about today, when we pitch climate change as structural violence against children, we are talking about systems change to address climate justice. And in doing that, my first approach is to use an intergenerational lens to be able to approach that. As we started this webinar today, talking about traditional lands, our ancestors, our generations gone by, have not only brought lands to us, which we have now inherited and privatized, but they've, more important, they've brought knowledge, they've brought wisdom, and they've brought worldviews. And therefore, today, we now face the challenge of establishing the link between that knowledge, wisdom, and worldview with the context in which our societies are. And that's what we mean by intergenerational equity. At the end of the day, it means fairness or justice between generations. So climate change needs to be seen as an issue of intergenerational equity, because what we consume today, what we exploit today, creates costs for future generations. Intergenerational equity represents a widely recognized principles of international environmental law, providing for the preservation of natural resources in the environment for the benefit of future generations. So therefore, international environment law has already given us a legal framework to establish intergenerational equity. It is therefore an obligation for us to use that international instrument for future generations. But the main questions to ask with intergenerational justice are the following: whether present generations can be duty bound because of consideration of justice to past, our ancestors, as well as our future. Whether other moral considerations should guide those currently alive, we, today, in relating to both past and the future. How to interpret the significance of past injustice in terms of what is owed to the descendants of the direct victims of those injustices today. Those are the key questions we need to ask. Now, there's an interesting debate going on. And the question is this: do future people have human rights? I've looked at a range of climate change litigations that have been brought to international courts. And what you realize is prosecutors and lawyers and even judges arguing that future people cannot have rights because they do not exist, and therefore cannot have anything including rights. They tell us future human beings are indeterminate and contingent, not actual, without a legal identity. They tell us we cannot know their number or their needs, their desires or tastes. Indeed, we cannot even be sure that they will exist in the future. Therefore, these skeptics say presently living persons cannot have legal obligation to future generations. This is a legal argument we need to challenge, because we know from the Convention on the Rights of the Child that the children's best interests are not confined to the present. They must include concern for the future, and therefore it logically means we need to hold today's duty bearers, governments, corporate and institutions, accountable for the ravages of climate change and its impact on the future. Let's go back to where we started. The knowledge, the wisdom, and the worldviews of our past generations has helped us to arrive at where we are today. It is those elders in our communities who can provide both mentoring and social and political space that empower young people. We therefore need to facilitate and support that transfer of knowledge, wisdom, and solutions from our elders to our young people. In other words, we need to strengthen this intergenerational solidarity at all levels. This brings us to accountability. Who is accountable for this structural violence? We know those that edify, perpetuate, and continue structural violence on children based on climate change are governments, the state, private sector, multinational corporations, bilateral, multilateral organizations. But let me also add certain community groups as well. On the one side. On the other side, you have those others who are struggling to redress that situation. Very much led today by children and young people, individuals, NGOs, indigenous and ethnic minority groups. How dare you? In my view, accountability has no boundaries. I strongly argue the case that political sovereignty of nation states and governments, even within the UN system, is confined to national boundaries and territories. But when we talk of accountabilities related to climate change and structural violence, those accountabilities of nation states and governments go beyond national boundaries. And based on regional and international law to which they're committed, they therefore need to be held accountable for violation of the rights of children and communities across boundaries. Let's look at what children have said themselves. Asia Pacific Youth Declaration, 2011 Kathmandu, children said, we need to develop flexible, transparent, and accountability mechanisms. We need to establish simple and efficient environmental governance by governments from central to state, local levels. We need to develop standards and certification mechanisms to hold them accountable. We need to establish local decentralized economies where ownership of natural resources and business profits are equitably shared among local stakeholders. Ridhima Pandey, 9-year-old from India, the youngest girl, a daughter of environmental activists. She took the Indian government to court in 2017. She filed National Green Tribunal, a special court, accused the government of India of failing to take action to meet the targets in the Paris Agreement. She said, quote, my government has failed to take steps to regulate and reduce greenhouse gas emissions and are causing extreme climate conditions. This will impact both me and future generations, unquote. Jason, 17-year-old from the Philippines, a veteran environmentalist, filed cases against the government of the Philippines for the loss of traditional lands. He opposed business and political interests responsible for the felling of trees, launching protests against illegal tree cutting in Benguet, in the mountain regions of the Philippines. He said, quote, I was profiled, unidentified people went to my school and got all sorts of information about me. My mother was warned to tell me to stop protesting, unquote. But he said at the same time, quote, when you put economy over ecology, it is downright greed, unquote. To also look at climate change litigation cases, I would refer you to the recent report, UNEP, the status of climate change litigation 2020. The report states that as of 2020, July 1st, over 1,550 cases of climate impact have been refiled in courts in 38 countries. Or the large majority are from the USA, 1,200, and 350 cases from all other countries. And we're going to see more and more of child litigation cases on climate change as we move forward in various countries. So, where do we go from here? What does an alternative approach or reframing climate change as structural violence against children? That is a starting point. This will help us to shift the advocacy, to shift the knowledge and the action to a higher level than where we are now in terms of the advocacy on climate change. This opens up new avenues for understanding, knowledge, and strategies to also empower our children and young people in that struggle against climate change. And in doing so, we need to challenge the structures and mechanisms at the global and local levels that are perpetuating the situation of climate change and climate disasters as we move forward. Let me conclude with a quote from one of my mentors, great friend, colleague, and for many of us in this audience as well, Professor Burns Weston. He put it very plainly and simply. He said, quote, "Somewhere deep inside, all of us know that life is an energetic concurrence of the past, present, and future, that we are a temporary part of it, and that whatever our past failings, we must reach beyond our egoistic selves to ensure that is continuity with fairness to today's children and communities of the future," unquote. At the end of the day, it is fairness to our children that we and our governments need to act on. And my final word, I would even go to the extent to argue today, based on my thinking to prepare for this presentation, I will claim that like nuclear threat, like wars, like famines, like pandemics, COVID-19, today we reach a situation where climate change is as much an existential threat to humanity, our future, generations, and the living Mother Earth. So I would put forward a challenge to all of us. Can we today call climate change as a crime against humanity and Mother Earth? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Victor. So with that amazing presentation to really explore the fairness between generations and exploring intergenerational equity, looking at the duty bearers of structural violence, exploring the fact that accountability has no boundaries, exploring the multi-pronged approaches to tackle climate action, and really just putting it out there that this can be considered not only violence, structural violence, but even more profoundly a crime against humanity and Mother Earth. With that, thank you so much, Victor. I should also say we're going to leave the questions towards the end. We're going to have our two other speakers and then have all the questions together. But I do also want to turn the microphone over to Professor Jeffrey Gold-Hagen, who is a professor and chief of Division of Community and Societal Pediatrics, Program Director of Community and Societal Pediatrics Fellowship at the University of Florida. And he's going to explore a little bit more of the logic behind thinking about structural violence and climate action. So please, Jeffrey.
Great. Well, Victor, that was excellent and appreciated very, very much. So I'm going to take a step back and just really try to frame the context of climate change as, in fact, structural violence, which is clearly not something that we have focused in the past, but as Victor presented, I think is critical as we move forward. Maybe I'm going to do this. Let's see if we can move. And so the first question is the traditional question that if it's not us, then who is going to pursue these issues? And if not now, then when? We've moved from climate change to climate crisis now we're really in a climate emergency, and it's up to us at this point in time if we are going to address this. And so I'm just going to present a really very basic logical framework. If A equals B and B equals C, then A equals C. And so the question is then, if in fact, if A, climate change, and I like to add globalization to this, if I can get this to work. Okay, so if climate change and globalization, and I think that in fact the two need to come together, are the root causes of global childhood morbidities and mortalities. And when we think in terms of the global impact on children, it's issues related to war and violence, migration and refugees, poverty, malnutrition, emerging infections, and environmental catastrophes. So if climate change and globalization are the root causes of these global childhood morbidities, and as we can see here, these are the type of issues that are impacting so profoundly children, whether it's malnutrition or child soldiers or children on the move, refugees and immigrants and so on. Then if A equals B and these root cause morbidities and mortalities are a function of violence against children, then climate change equals violence against children. And by this, I mean structural violence and institutional violence against children. So that climate change is in fact equivalent to violence and structural violence against children. And if violence against children are fundamental violations of children's rights, then climate change is in fact a fundamental violation of children's rights. And so for those of us who are in the audience, this seems self-obvious, but in talking to others and in presenting this as Victor had presented earlier, we need to be thinking in terms of climate change as in fact a fundamental violation of children's rights. And for those of us involved with children's rights, we always go back to the Convention on the Rights of the Child. And what I've done here in a very superficial way is outline in white what some of the violations are in the context of the various articles of the convention. So from discrimination and addressing best interests to access to information, as Victor said, to respecting the children's voices and to listen to them, to protection from violence and so on and so forth. These are some of the critical articles of the convention that need to be addressed as it relates to climate change as a fundamental issue of child rights. And in addition, obviously, to addressing these issues in the context of the convention, it's also important to address these issues in the context of the Sustainable Development Goals. And what's so profoundly important is that when you look at the SDGs, the number of them that are focused specifically on climate and the environment, from responsible consumption by all to stopping climate change, protecting the ocean, to taking care of the earth, to living in peace. All of these, in addition to the others, but these are directly related to the issues related to climate change and climate change as a fundamental issue of human rights and structural violence. It's critically important when you think in these terms to also consider the critical principles of human rights, and in our particular perspective, child rights. Victor identified and spoke specifically to accountability, But the three which I think are critically important as we pursue this issue of rights as structural violence, as climate change, as structural violence. First is the universality, that in fact, these issues affect children wherever they are without exception as they cross borders and over time. So the first is universality. The second, which I think in some ways is most important, is the issue of indivisibility and interdependence. When we look at the violation of human rights, we can't really focus on one right, but really need to focus on all rights, so that in order to guarantee civil and political rights, a government must ensure economic, social, and cultural rights, and vice versa. So it provides us an opportunity to really look at the whole child in many respects, because we can't just identify one right, but really have to look at all rights when we address these issues. And of course, participation, and in our perspective, the issue of ensuring Article 12, that children have the right to have a voice and to be listened to. And as Victor so eloquently presented, really represents the profound challenge to us all into the future, which is ensuring that children are at the front and center at addressing these issues. Victor mentioned earlier the structural issues of all domains in society. And so when we look at the structural content of our communities, we focus on economic rights, cultural rights, social rights, protective rights, and civil and political rights. These are the domains of structural integrity. And so each of these different areas then can be framed in the context of different rights that are identified in the Convention of the Rights of the Child. So when we think of structural violence, right, we can think of violence in the context of violation of rights in these five different elements, these five different domains, which provides us now a way to think in terms of how we address these different areas of structural violence as it relates to children and child rights. This is a figure that comes from a UNICEF article a number of years ago, and a UNICEF publication from a number of years ago. And it takes us from climate change through a number of pathways, through a number of different structural and systems issues that are impacting us globally, down to the actual outcomes of those pathways, which is childhood morbidity increases, child malnutrition increases, child equity decreases, child poverty increases, reduction in child protection, and children out of school. If these are in fact the structural and institutional issues that are being impacted by climate change and are in fact profound violations of children's rights. So there are three certainties. The first is that climate change is induced by us. That climate change and nuclear holocaust represent the two existential threats to humankind that Victor had also mentioned, and that if we're going to address climate change, that we have to be using the principles and parlance of human rights, and that needs to be the foundation and framework for all of our dialogue and discussion, and that climate change is in fact fundamentally a violation of human rights. When we look at a history of rights, and use this as an example in the United States, ultimately we end up at this point in time in the context of child rights and climate rights. These become the primary focus of our contemporary challenges in front of us. Climate rights, as Victor so eloquently mentioned, is in fact an issue of child rights. And children are today, interestingly enough, and will in the future be the primary voice to identify not only the issues that are impacting them, but the way forward. And if we are going to frame this context in children, then and the context in child rights, then we need a child rights-based approach to address these issues. And there's been a tremendous amount of experience over the past 2 decades in framing the work that we do in the context of a child rights-based approach. So that in the few minutes that I have, we can't really explore this to any great extent. But in fact, we don't have to reinvent the wheel, that there are the principal standards and norms that have been addressed over the last 2 decades that provide us a framework for a child rights-based approach to addressing climate change. And what is not apparent must be made explicit. And once explicit, we as individuals and organizations must be prepared to enable and empower ourselves and children and youth to ground and advance all of our endeavors related to child rights in the principal standards and norms of human rights. And to that, let me present just an advertisement for the International Society of Social Pediatrics. As you can see, there's a link at the bottom to our declaration, which addresses a response to the impact of climate crisis on children and youth. Encourage you to visit our website on which the declaration is presented, and to thank you for all that you are doing regionally and nationally and globally to address these challenges. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Jeffrey. Really good call to us to really make explicit the existential crisis that we find ourselves in, and to really unpack the logic behind understanding structural violence as a good framework for moving forward with children's rights and looking at children's violations of their fundamental rights, and also pushing us to look at the whole child and explore the different ways in which children's rights give us the impetus to explore the structures of economic, cultural, social, protective, civil, and political. Amazing. And maybe also, Jeffrey, if you want to put the link to, well, you did already, Selena did already, thank you. With that, we've looked at a broad picture with Victor and Jeffrey, but now we want to look a little bit more specifically at a case example. And with that, I want to introduce Dr. Jennifer Leaning, who is a senior research fellow at the FXB Center at Harvard University. Also associate professor of emergency medicine at Brigham and Women's Hospital. And she's going to give us a little bit of a taste of a specific area where we're seeing impact on children because of climate change, and we may see this exacerbated. So looking at forced migration as an outcome of climate change, again, looking at structural violence against children. So please, Jennifer.
Thank you very much. And I'm very pleased to be third in the lineup, because the 2 previous presenters have given really remarkable and elegant overlapping frameworks for how to look at issue of climate change and children. Legal, very deft and substantive, and then more from the documents that we do know apply in the international community and therefore to all nation states related to how we think about the envelopment of children in a number of different approaches to our current world and the future. and what I would like to do is to talk about a more narrow and difficult topic, which will be the issue of children in a context of forced migration, which has its own imprint on our world now. And this is an example, in my mind, a very large example of forced migration leading to structural violence against children. So this is my argument. I study war and disasters through the context of international norms, including human rights norms. And so I will be proceeding from that perspective and hope to argue that when you think of an element of structural violence against children, you will think about climate change, because that has been the major argument so far in this discussion, and abundantly and vigorously made. And then I will then talk about forced migration as a subset of structural violence against children. The point here is that forced migration is an outcome of armed conflict as people flee hostilities. We have seen this now through every lens we apply: historical, geospatial, photographs, reports, investigations of armed conflict dating back millennia. People who are not actual combatants flee where the war is going on, if they can, and they wind up being an element of this vast stream of forced migration. They are moving because they have to get out of the active hostile zone. Major disasters also are the creators of forced migration. Whether it's a sudden onset disaster, which usually is built into the definition of a disaster, it occurs suddenly. No disaster, however, occurs without significant warning. If people are trained to be looking, if people have an alert frame of mind, if people have, in fact, what is my point of view, a skepticism about the stability of the world. You could never count on anything. So disasters are in many ways a form of life, and they, in the relationship to climate change, they are getting far worse, affecting much larger numbers of people, and in some ways even changing what our understanding of drought and flood might actually be, because of the scale on which climate change is imposing slow and rapid onset disasters. So here is where I want to focus, that is the outcome of climate change as people move to seek safety or new sources of livelihood. Forced migration explicitly in the context of climate change. This has not been very well studied yet. It is a phenomenon that everyone in the international humanitarian rights and development community is becoming increasingly aware of. But as you'll see as I go through this discussion of what the norms are and what the numbers are and what happens to children, you will see that there is a relative paucity of data. Now, good data, I mean, to some extent, is armed conflict, which I told you is a fundamental driver of forced migration in our world. And this chart shows you a chronic situation where the armed conflicts have been moderately steady after World War II, and then they began to erupt as countries came out of the colonial rule in the 40s and 50s by going to war against their colonial rulers. And then these wars and others transmogrified into a large number of what we call intrastate conflicts, that is, that are waged within a state or between a ruler against rival parties within the state. And then there are formal armed conflicts where you have wars between the states. But you can see here, and this is my point, that the vast majority of these conflicts since beginning about the 1970s are turning out to be waged in Africa, which is yellow on this graph, or in Asia, which is blue in this graph, or in the Middle East is increasing, which is the red pink in this graph. And Europe and the United States have a relatively small number of these. The other point is that once these wars start, they persist. So the war that you see in 1985 is the same war you're going to see in 2014. Many of these last 30 or 40 years. So the countries and the regions within continents that are really oppressed by war have been so oppressed by a very long time. And so they are major contributors to forced migration as people leave the war zones. And this is where we get the concept of refugees, that is, people who are fleeing war or armed conflict. The next point that I would like to make is that, as you see, the largest number of these armed conflicts are marked by this gray bar that is really increased after about 2000. And these are intra-state wars, which are the least well examined, which are the prevalent forms of distress and disarray for the world's peoples. They are not as tightly bound by international law. Human rights law is only variously applicable. Many of the conventions are not looking at what happens to people trapped in these intrastate wars. This is a condition of millions of people. A remarkable document that just came out in this last year by the International Committee of the Red Cross, which is the bearer of observation, interpretation, and enforcement of international humanitarian law. The ICRC came out with this very, very good document that's called Displacement in Times of Armed Conflict. And it's the first time that the major institution that studies and observes and tries to contain the atrocities of war, it is the first time that they have noted that displacement is a prevalent and increasingly terrible outcome of armed conflict. It's a great document, and you can get it on the web, and I commend it to all of you to look at. Truly, it talks so much about war and its various kinds, and then so much about what is happening when people are displaced. And you could use this, actually, because I read it, you could use this as sort of the surrogate for what happens to people in any kind of displacement. It's a very robust document, and it will, in my mind, be something that people who are worried about climate change and its potential to cause forced migration, if not mass migration, this should be something that we look at from the climate change perspective. Now, within this phenomenon of forced migration and war and to some extent climate change, there are prevailing norms that I would like to draw to your attention. There are norms of child protection. You've heard these words by Victor and Jeffrey already. And child protection is a fabulously strong concept. And it's really been unpacked and iterated and applied in a large number of settings over the last 30 years. And this is a term that the humanitarian aid agencies and the UN use in the context of war and forced migration, refugees. It's used in armed disasters and now from collapsed livelihoods due to climate change. And child protection, essentially, as you can sense by the term, is something that people who are protected apply and try to instantiate in the constant context where children are not protected. So by implication, norms relating to child protection are directed at situations where the traditional child protection mechanisms are not working. And I put traditional in quotes because we all know that there are terrible lapses in child protection, most primitively in terms of protecting their life and then protecting their well-being and then protecting their future. There are great lapses that occur in ordinary domestic life in every nation state in the world. Okay, but this is in fact looking at unusual and worse circumstances in most cases of having to protect a child who is affected by armed conflict, disasters, and forced migration now due to climate change. Then another bundle of norms, which is really very important, relate to human security, which is a concept that began to be formalized by the international community in 1994. And there have been several major human security reports by the United Nations. One is coming out in the next year. I think I've been part of some of the discussions leading up to it. And over these years since 1994, the framework has really come down on human security is defined as freedom from fear, freedom from want, and preservation of dignity. And I know they wanted it to have a bounce in English, you know, freedom from fear, freedom from want, and freedom from, in fact, even Roosevelt, President Roosevelt, when he began these words in the 1940s during his presidency, had this phrase of freedom from different things. It didn't scan well. So the human security people are in good company. Freedom from fear, freedom from want, and preservation of dignity actually is a very forceful phrase. And if you think about the robust meaning behind this, a life where you are free from at least acute and chronic fear, where you don't want for the basics, and in fact, you don't want from those goods that actually nurture and expand your life prospects. And then preservation of dignity, another phenomenally crucial word in human rights language, where you are somebody and you stand for yourself and you have a sense of what is going to happen to you and you can determine what you want to do. The human security phrase here now speaks to many things that are in high jeopardy with climate change. Another version of human security, which I and others have written about, is to try to concretize it in the setting of war, migration, and forced migration from environmental collapse and disasters. And is to say that you have human security. This is an element that a person has. When you have a stable sense of home, that it's there and it protects you, that you have a sense of a good community around you. Now, there are many communities that are actually problematic, but you have a community that is not just based up relatives, but where you, and you know, in the context of post-conflict settings, you can go down the street light works, you can drop off your shoes at a shoemaker whom you do not know, not a family member. You go back home after the shoemaker says, fine, I can do it for $2, come back in a week. Here's a little chit to remind you and me that you dropped your shoes. You go back in a week, you hand the shoemaker the little chit, and he gives you the shoes that are repaired and you give him $2. That transaction is essentially based on community norms. And wow, in forced migration settings, when you are there talking to refugees and forced migrants, that sense of community is usually destroyed. Mm-hmm. And then you have trust in the future. That is, you're willing to invest in your life into the future. Your parents are willing to save for your education. Your mother is willing to plant fruit trees, knowing that it will take 12 to 15 years before they bear fruit. And you as a child are willing to study hard and save your money because you know you're going to have high school and college ahead of you. So these are the elements of human security that, you know, really apply in my interpretation to people who are already forced migrants. Prevailing norms and practice continue. And in addition to the human rights documents that Jeffrey and Victor talked about, although they both hearken to this, international humanitarian law, which is a law that applies in armed conflict, international human rights law, which is generally speaking the rights that apply to people not in the state of active conflict. The Convention on the Rights of the Child, most particularly, which has been beautifully explored by both the previous speakers, and then humanitarian norms that apply in a context where humanitarian agencies, including the UN and ICRC, but also the NGOs, are participating in trying to provide public health and protection to vulnerable populations. And I will speak most about the humanitarian norms, because if you look at these documents that apply to people in hard circumstances, these are the documents and principles that are going to have major impact on setting the normative framework for the world and for nation states when they're looking at people, particularly children who are displaced in forced migration. And they will come into being not now in what we understand to be the case, that is refugees in Lebanon from the war in Syria, but they'll come into being with populations that have spread around the savanna area of Africa or coming from Houston, Texas into a more stable part of the Midwest. They will apply in terms of how you take care of people. And the most vulnerable people in all of these settings, the most vulnerable ones, are, as I'm sure you're aware, children. Now, this is a graphic that we in Physicians for Human Rights helped frame for the New York Times cover when they were talking about the deaths from the wars in the Congo in the mid-1990s. And they were looking at nonviolent deaths, that is, the deaths of people who had fled from the acute fighting and were hiding out in the forests of the Democratic Republic of Congo, in the bush. They were forced migrants from war. And if you look at this, this is based on epidemiologic studies. In one sample, there were 62 nonviolent deaths in the previous year from the conflict, that is the people who fled. But if you notice, over half of them were to children under the age 15. This is the point, that when populations flee from war, or I would submit from disaster, or from some extent from climate change, the children die. And around that, there's a penumbra of the children who live have great deprivations that they have to endure. In the context of forced migration, and not just within armed conflict, it has a high impact on women and children because they are fleeing. It's either slow or rapid. But every photograph you have seen of people fleeing from disasters or from armed conflict or from climate change slowly, you see that the women tend to be in charge of the children, and the faster the flight to get out of danger, the more difficult it is for the women to protect the children. And when children suffer, when families suffer, but it is actually the primitive point that when the mother suffers, you really begin to have to be concerned about the well-being of the child. And all of you listening just have to think about if it's been your experience or the experience of someone within your family. When a mother dies, a very big issue is how are the children going to survive, let alone thrive. So forced migration tends to crush the women because they are taking care of the kids or carrying them or moving encumbered with pregnancy or a baby that is still at the breast, a toddler who has to be picked up most of the time, high risk for child survival because of the impact through the mothers. And then you have, once the flight pattern has moved, you have these complex resettlement and recovery issues in forced migration. As again, I'm talking about forced migration from many forces, but this will be the case also in climate change, and it increasingly is. Camps are difficult places in which to thrive. You have women who have lost their adult sons and their husbands from the war, or trying to protect people and they getting harmed, killed. Really huge issues of can you go back in terms of claims over land and property. Very, very stressful new roles and new exposures at the time when women and men are completely blitzed by the migration process. I mean, they've lost their bearings. They are not good problem solvers. They're not well nourished. They're afraid, and they have to manage. And so these psychological issues wind up being not just prevalent, but important impairments to coping. Now, child protection in acute instances of forced migration from disasters or conflict, it's not highly articulated. And once you look at this, you'll find, I mean, the Declaration of Human Rights, I mean, the Convention on Human Rights is behind these norms. But in fact, once you look for the norms in the humanitarian context, the protection of children is really nested in the protection of parents, especially the women. I mean, UNICEF is the major organization that is looking at protection of children in distress situations. And they would be the first to say that they cannot actually ensure the long-term health or the long-term education of children in these disturbed and unstable settings. It is just too heavy a lift for their human power, manpower, women power, and it's too heavy a lift for the organization. And then you have unaccompanied children who are in the hardest category, all right? And they're cared for by UN agencies and the humanitarians. But they do not have an encompassing family, and that cannot be replaced once it's gone. Now, this is a photograph taken from a helicopter. I did not take it. Inside the border of Darfur, as it bordered on Chad. I was doing human rights work with refugees who were fleeing the war in Darfur in the mid-2000s, but doing it from the Chad side where we picked up and could talk to refugees. But just for a second, this is a really important slide because even though I was one of the people of many who were saying that the war in Darfur had ethnic cleansing, if not genocidal aspects, I won't go into the politics, right? An underlying part of this, and my colleague Alex Duvall, who's an expert on Darfur, argued with me strenuously. He didn't deny it might be genocide, but he said the underlying part of it was desertification and drought and loss of shared livelihoods among the pastoralists and the farmers. And so this is like an early indication, mid-2000s, of how climate change could actually interact with ethnic animosities. And this is women fleeing the attacks on their villages. And if you can see here, almost all of them are encumbered by children, carrying them, holding onto them. And if they are not clearly encumbered by children, you can bet they're pregnant, because this is a high fertility society. And they have to survive at least 20 to 50 kilometers run across the desert, pursued by the assailants to get across the border into Chad. This helicopter was near the Chad border, so they were almost making it. I interviewed some of these women and children and men, I mean, many times during this process in the Chad border. And here you see a family, which is actually pretty lucky, because you could see that this woman who was talking to the interpreter at the moment, or talking to me actually, and my colleague was taking the photograph, and we had an interpreter standing next to me. So she was looking at me and the interpreter, but the kids you could see were looking at the photographer, who's a white man. And if you were to say which of these children are going to do very well, having fled the massacres in their villages across the desert, which it was, landing up in this very makeshift hut in the refugee camps. It was before the UN had come to build more stable settings and to set up their tents. I would say a number of them are not beginning to cope with what they've been through. And you can tell that from looking at the kids. This young woman who is looking at me is very skeptical. And the only one who actually has a certain kind of presence, even though he's not particularly clean and he's dealing with the flies, is the very small child. But I know this is an impression, but when you're starting to talk to refugees, you have to have a sense of who's with you, who isn't, and who may have already signs of, major experiences that are difficult. And whatever lies ahead for this stalwart woman is going to be the problems of feeding, taking care in terms of health and sanitation and educating these children. It's going to land on her shoulders. And that's a very high burden. This is a photograph that I did not take, but it's from a context where I was working. This is in the context of the Bosnia War, Kosovo War, and people are fleeing Bosnia, going to more safe areas. And they are clamoring to get into the UNHCR buses that are going to take them to safety. You can see how people can lose track of children, lose track of goods, lose track of each other. And the UNHCR and the Red Cross put these tags on these kids, buttoned to their shirt, that says who you are, who you're related to, and where you're supposed to be. This is child protection in the context of forced migration. And there's a lot more work we need to do to make sure that this child and all of the others that are going to be in forced migration from climate change have a better send-off and a better welcome than this child might have. So if you're thinking about climate change, it has a slow onset, but then it can vault into something very rapid. And the planning for anticipated population movements in the context of climate change is not widespread. We know that people usually move from rural to urban areas, first within their countries and then across international borders. But most of what we know is from war or acute disaster. And so I would propose that there's an enormous amount of work to build out the fundamentals of child protection in terms of how we shore it up in these contexts of forced migration. The core concerns, of course, remain survival and well-being and thriving. So the point about forced migration is that it is upon us. Climate change is upon us. They're going to interact in very powerful ways. And the international community needs to begin to develop the rubrics for the numbers, where people are going, what is happening to them, and how we adjust our norms and our practices to support these populations long term. There are currently about 84 million refugees and internally displaced peoples by UN count as of the end of 2020. But there are tens of millions of people who are not counted, who flee into the cities, who flee into the hinterland, who don't self-identify, who are doing it in smaller groups. And we have no idea really how many people now are the early forced migrants from climate change. But I would submit what we know of the structural violence in other forms of migration that impose on children, we know for sure that they will have similar, if not, similar privations. It's unclear what futures they will have. It will require many more people that are in the humanitarian community or in the UN to support these children and families through time. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jennifer. Really useful to look at a specific area and to overlay some of the things that we know about humanitarian law and forced migration from armed conflict and disasters, and really kind of look at what we have in store for us in the most horrific way in terms of the vast stream of forced migration that's potential because of climate change, but also the exacerbation of current armed conflicts because of climate and other environmental disasters. Really useful and overall amazing presentations, and a big heartfelt thank you to everyone. We don't have a great deal of time left, so I want to jump right into some of the questions that are popping up here. So Karen has asked about the applicability of international criminal law, whether or not looking at the International Criminal Court for Crimes Against Humanity could be a place to bring environmental challenges either to that court or to the International Court of Justice. I know neither of them have been particularly good at looking at international human rights, but maybe there's some space for moving this into the future. And I pose that question, I think, to Victor, because you were the one who suggested we should look at a crime against humanity.
Yeah, I have looked at this for a while. Firstly, the regulations that govern the ICJ, International Criminal Court, ICC in particular, do not allow for cases like climate justice or climate change to be brought, because it's transborder, like I said. Yeah. Firstly, you have to be a member of the International Criminal Court. Secondly, any submission to the International Criminal Court has to come from a member state against possibly another member state or whatever. That's already circumvents any possibility of a global issue like climate change being brought to the International Criminal Court. But then I thought for a while, and I was asking myself, why don't countries like Maldives, we followed the case of Maldives, right? Which is even trying to buy another island to move the whole population. Why doesn't a country like Maldives file a case in the International Criminal Court? Why don't countries in the Pacific, Fiji, Solomon Islands, Cook Islands, Niue, you have a whole range of islands that are making a big noise about climate change. But why are these member states not willing to bring any case before the International Criminal Court? That's a question to ask. It's a political question. And that's the only way you're going to get anything before the International Criminal Court, as the rules stand right now. So those are, to me, clear advocacy points for us within the UN system, among civil society, and among children and young people themselves. So I would make a big call to children, young people in the Maldives, in the Pacific Islands, in all the other island states, including the Caribbean, to now start thinking about possibly pushing the advocacy to bring their governments accountable before the International Criminal Court. And that's the only way it's going to be possible. You're not going to get politicians to do that, but I think children and young people have the courage and the determination, if they're supported, to be able to do that for the rest of us to support. That would be my response.
I would say there's a rhetorical power, however, Victor. I mean, crime against humanity has now become a globally charged word and recognized for among the most awful ways in which a force, a nation state, can affect a population. And as you say, there may be claimants that could have standing, but I believe it is a term that we could use and take the language from the statute, from the Rome Statute, and apply it as we're analyzing a particular situation. For instance, in this case of Syria, where the government of Syria for 5 years ignored the fact that there was a progressive drought in the Northeast, in fact, insisted on planting crops that were completely water consumptive. The farmers and herders lost their livelihoods. And basically in the years leading up to the war in Syria, 1 million people left the Northeast and went into the towns in the western part of Syria where the land is green, and it was cities. And there's an argument that this influx helped precipitate the instabilities that led to the war. So that this is where, if we were in a place of observation, thinking about structural violence and about climate change, the use of the term crimes against humanity could be, from a standpoint of advocacy and analysis, levied against the Syrian government long before the war broke out.
And on that note, it would kind of posit an interesting question to move forward with, in really thinking about how could we use this evocative terminology to really address and look at some of the structural issues that meet in that nexus of structural violence climate change and youth voice. This has been such a fantastic set of conversations, and I really hesitate to conclude it, but we have reached our time, and hope that everyone will continue to check in to see about next steps, next webinars to really further delve into this topic. And Selena, did you have a final word that you wanted to share?
Thank you so much, Kathleen, and to all of our panelists and the sponsoring organizations who made this session possible. From our chat box, we can see so many of us worldwide are engaged in this topic. So what I'll be sure to do is we'll send out a follow-up email to everyone with the recording of today's session, include the links that were shared throughout our panelist presentations, and some information on how to keep in contact for our coming sessions as well. So that's all from me, Kathleen. I'll pass it back to you to close us out for today.
Okay, thank you. That's really it. And I apologize that we didn't get to everyone's questions. Again, hopefully you've had some thought-provoking space here to really look at structural violence and climate change. And again, just a really big thank you for everyone for coming. It's been such a pleasure, and a massive thank you to our speakers. It has been amazing to spend some more time with you and to hear your thoughts on this. So again, thanks everyone.